Good evening. Let's go back in time 150 or so years. It's the middle of the 19th century. The situation in Europe, as in most of the known world, was that it had suffered through the effects of 1,000 years or so of history that had not been kind to people like you and me. The whole system as it was then had done its best to keep the masses down where they should be. The state, through various monarchies and so on, had kept them dirt poor. The church had done its best to keep them ignorant. Men of science like Charles Darwin, the gentleman in the photo, were in the process of asking questions about the big issues of life. Where did we come from, for one? So, from the mid-1800s, this became a hot topic, and it has remained so ever since. Well, if we skipped 100 years or so, we come to around 1967. Now, I was a bright-eyed third former at a local high school, and the science teacher showed us this diagram of the progression of man, and he linked that with Charles Darwin and his giant Galapagos tortoises, and explained where we came from, and to me the explanation sounded very plausible. Darwin's ideas were backed up with solid archaeological evidence, or so it seemed, and the alternative was not discussed at all in any serious way. So, for a number of years, this is what I was convinced actually happened. I am absolutely certain if we asked the man in the street how he came to be here, then these diagrams would come into his answer in some form. So, what's the problem with that? Well, what it does, of course, is it provides a solution where God does not exist and has had no part in any of what we see and experience. It replaces the core of Bible teaching with an array of ideas we have placed under the umbrella of this one word, evolution. But is this really how we got here? Is it really the only logical explanation? Well, we're convinced that this is not the case. The alternative, of course, is creation. Now, if one single word of this Bible is true, then it's all got to be true. And if we could get ourselves to that point, then our lives would be so much the richer for it. That's the position that I now take, and that we all take, and we wouldn't deviate from it under any circumstances. But the debate, and this picture just kind of embodies that debate. Like I said, it affected me during high school when we were told about Darwin's ideas and that we were told that he was right, and that's how we got here. And creation was, during my time anyway, was not even mentioned, but it was seen as an explanation for the weak and the simple of mind who couldn't come to grips with the reality of the scientific answers that had come forth from people like Darwin. And so the debate wages on. And we have to ask, verse 1 true, or is there really another explanation? Well, this guy Marconi, who invented the radio, these ideas have been around from time immemorial. He said the uniformity of Earth's life, more astonishing than its diversity, so it's more astonishing that things are so similar, is accountable by the high probability that we derived originally from some single cell fertilised in a bolt of lightning as the Earth cooled. And that's the kind of core of the ideas that people like Darwin may have started their work off with. But then again, Sir Isaac Newton, who we're with and would have a lot of respect for his ideas, said, how came the bodies of animals to be contrived with so much art? And for what ends were their several parts? Was the eye contrived without skill in optics, and the ear without knowledge of sounds? See, in around about the same time, he had looked at these things and come at it from an entirely different view and said, this can't have been a result of an accident, surely. There must have been an intelligent designer behind it all. Well, what I'd like to suggest is that we run our story this evening on the basis of these two men. Don't they look similar? You'd think they could have been brothers. They were born around about the same time. John Thomas was born in 1805 and Darwin 4 years later in 1809. Thomas was born in London and Darwin was born not a couple of hundred k's away in a place called Shrewsbury, not the biscuit. They both died within cooey of each other, and they have both been pretty influential on the way we think. Darwin was the son of a minister, so he had a real background in the church and church affairs, and he wanted to be a doctor. But in medical school, they did an operation, so the story goes, on a little girl without anaesthetic, and Charles Darwin decided he wanted to be something else. Couldn't stand the sight of blood, so they say. John Thomas, who was born around about the same time, actually did become a doctor. So, amazing coincidences. Charles Darwin decided, after he knew he didn't want to become a doctor, he decided to, and a relative of his happened to get him on a ship, the HMS Beagle, which did a 5-year journey from England around into the southern oceans and actually stopped in New Zealand here for about 9 days in 1836 or so. John Thomas also went on a journey. He grabbed up his family and decided to go across to America to live, as a doctor, no doubt. His ship banged into an island just short of the United States, and Dr. John Thomas decided that he didn't know much of his future, he didn't know much about the Bible, even though he'd been brought up around it, and that if he ever got out of this alive, he was going to make it his life's work to find out. So, interesting that their paths were sort of paralleling along the way. John Thomas would train as a doctor. He did actually find out what the Bible really taught, and he sharpened his understanding on some of the religious groups that were in the States at the time, and finally went back to England where he preached and so on. Well, what did they have in common? Thomas was apparently not satisfied with the church teachings because he wanted to find out what the Bible wanted to say for himself. He turned specifically to the Bible for the answers that it had. He wrote a book, a copy of which I have here, one of a couple that he wrote, Elpis Israel, and he attracted what was to be a long-term following, which is why most of us are in the hall here now. Charles Darwin wasn't happy with church teachings either, or wondered about them. He thought he might go off and see the world and observe for himself what had gone on. He rather reluctantly wrote a book in about 1859, and he too has attracted a very strong, very, very vociferous long-term following. So it's kind of the story of evolution for us in the hall anyway, is about these two men, largely, and we have to say the only one talking this kind of evolutionary development. He came after a fairly long line of people who'd thought kind of similar things. But this Origin of Species was published in November of 1859, and people who are tied up in the scientific world still look at it as a work to be looked at with some reverence. And the full title of it originally, when he first wrote it, was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. That says it all, really. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. That's what he called it. No wonder he shortened it down. To be covered in the second of the books that I think is probably worth looking at. The first words of our other man in his book were, or the ones that I've written there really, revolving upon its own axis and describing an ample circuit through the boundless fields of space, is a planet of the solar system bearing upon its surface a population of over 1,000 million subject to sin. Well, there's a lot more than that now, and death. This orb of the starry heaven shines with a glory similar to that of its kindred spheres. Viewed from them, it is seen sparkling like a diamond in the sky, and with the rest of the heavens declares the glory of God and shows forth the handiwork of him that did create it. So he's poles apart positions when you have a look at the two men. Well, what was in Darwin's mind when he set off on the Beagle that he had is, I've got the quote here, he said, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent or a loving and thoughtful God and omnipotent God would have designedly created parasitic wasps with the express intention of their feeding within the living of caterpillars." That was one of the things that kind of annoyed him a bit, or that he wondered about. How could God have created a wasp whose sole means of producing young was to lay the eggs inside a living organism or caterpillar? And I guess we can understand why he would be wondering that. Dr. Thomas? Well, he said himself, "I wrote Elpis Israel to clear away the rubbish of the pulpits, the things that the churches were teaching, with which the readers might be oppressed, that the light of God might enter in." So they both kind of had a position which they were taking when they wrote their books. Well, Darwin, he set off in 1831. He had studied at Cambridge University. He got an arts degree. Like I said, he didn't finish his medical degree. Instead, what he thought he might do was study divinity, which is what he did, and become a pastor in a small church. What he was really interested in was natural history. So his real love was natural history, and he thought it would fit nicely into the life of a clergyman in a backwater country church. But he set off, and like I said, he even visited New Zealand in the Bay of Islands around Christmas of, must have been 1836, coming near the end of his voyage. And we know that he visited the Galapagos Islands out here off South America, and a lot of his observations were to do with that. So in this 5 years of voyaging, what conclusions did he come to? Well, he figured that individuals in nature differ from one another. He could see that. We can all see that. He said organisms in nature produce more offspring than can possibly survive. And many of those who don't survive, or who will not survive, the ones that are not the strongest, won't reproduce. Fair enough. That's what does happen in nature. He said that because more organisms are produced than can survive, each species then has to struggle for its survival. And that's where he got the survival of the fittest idea. He said each organism is unique. Yep, he was right. Each has advantages and disadvantages as it struggles for its existence. And he said only individuals best suited for the environment that they're living in will reproduce. And he said species change over time. They get better and better and better. And I don't know if we'd agree with him there. In fact, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't. In 1967, when I was first in, the evidence seemed to point very much to what was being told us. Well, he looked at the fossil record and he said, simpler things right at the bottom of the fossil record, more complicated things further up. He said, if you've got a geographical location, and this is where he got excited about the Galapagos Islands, if you've got a geographical location, you get, with a similar kind of environment, you get similar kind of organisms living there. He had a problem when he got to Australia, when he saw the grasslands over this side. He said, how come they haven't got rabbits here? He said, how come they haven't got kangaroos in England? Be a good place for them. But he couldn't answer those questions, of course. He saw then that the animals that he observed and drew and so on had homologous body structures. They kind of looked the same, and we'll look at that shortly. And he looked at the tiny embryonic development of the animals that he looked at, and he saw that they were remarkably similar. And so he said, we all came from the same thing. We all look the same when we're little, and we just develop into different animals. We must have come from the same. Well, there is a problem, however. Well, there's a problem for us. There probably wasn't a problem for Darwin, as it turns out. The problem is the age of the Earth. for animals to have changed the way he thought that they had changed in such a gradual way and just tiny incremental changes, the Earth had to be millions or hundreds of millions of years old. And now I notice scientists are talking about billions of years old. He looked at things like this giant armadillo and the giant anteater and places that he went and said, you know, they must have come from the same animal, but it would have taken a lot of gradual change for them to have started off as one or an ancestor of these and separately developed in separate places. I think if you are at all interested in the Bible, it shows a much simpler picture. It says that everything that he made, and behold, it was very good, and the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Not the 600 millionth year, not the 600,000th year, but the sixth day of that Genesis 1 period of time. And what we would say is Darwin was not right when he said it had to stretch back millennia for this to work. The second problem, Charles Darwin, if you have a look at his book Origin of the Species, he's got a little tree that grows up from several different kinds of animals and gets more complicated as different species branch off it. He actually had to admit that life as we know it started off very simple. It had to have. He said the intimate relationship between the vital phenomena with chemistry, its laws, makes the idea of spontaneous generation conceivable. Oh dear. This is the primordial puddle kind of a scenario where the chemicals were in there and something reacted with them. Like Marconi said, maybe lightning strike, and there was something living. So from that he kind of had to say, or evolutionists have had to say anyway, that the first organisms had to be just these little single cell blobby bacteria things, and as time went on they became more and more complicated. And later on the most complicated multicellular organisms included must have evolved following that process. Can you see how there might be one or two problems in that? Well, we think it would be far simpler, or I do anyway. Genesis 1 verse 30, and which says, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth on the earth wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat, and it was so. God said in that account, I created it all, I gave it to you. Seems now to me to be a much more plausible explanation than the one that I was given when I was 14 maybe. We've seen this before. We've seen this number before. I had to reproduce it because I couldn't find it. The chances of that little blobby bit of life actually spontaneously appearing like Darwin said it should have is 1 in... If that was the lotto numbers, you wouldn't even bother because you wouldn't win it. And it's round about the same as saying that that pocket watch, complete with its chain, which is made up of stuff that comes out of the earth largely, because that's how they made it, about the same chance of that little blobby piece of life coming out of the puddle is finding that watch on the sand in full working condition. Chances? Not very good. Well, the next problem that we see as Bible students was this idea of Darwin. About species. Remember I described the branches of his tree, you know, we started off with the blobby thing at the bottom and it developed into turtles over here and birds up here and other things over here. Darwin himself said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. So he says that if through the genes you can change to adapt to your environment, you're going to survive. And species, as the scientists would define it, are a group of organisms that can reproduce and can create offspring that can reproduce. And that's this whole, you know, lions can't mate with sheep and so on. Well, The Bible appears to have a great answer to the 8.5 million or so species of life that are on the earth at the moment. Genesis 1 has a phrase, and I've highlighted it in yellow there, after his kind. Remember, if Genesis 1 verse 1 is true and the rest of it's true, then let's think about what it's saying in verse 12, for example. God started his creative work, and it says, and the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind. What do we think that means? Well, the weed that's in the ground produces seed, and the little weed that grows up either close to it or wherever a bird drops the seed looks exactly like the parent. That's after his kind. And two seeds and so on don't intermingle with each other because they're separate species. And God set it up that way, after his kind. And that's why we only find the very outside of, horses breed with donkeys and you get a mule. But they're not a species because they can't breed after kind. And God created great whales and every creature that liveth after his kind. So lions don't breed with giraffes. And God set it up that way. And it's a wonderful thing in the way that he did set it up. Well, Darwin exercised himself on the problem of who actually does survive in an environment Well, Darwin said it's individuals who have favourable variations that they carry genetically are able to survive. He said we inherit genetic traits from our forebears, and he was right. And if we are able to use those things in our environment, then we will survive. The Bible has salvation as one of its core themes. Random verse that I've chosen to have a look at it from the angle of. There's a plan of salvation in the Bible set out for all of us. And we don't have to worry about Darwin and his survival of the fittest. Because if we're prepared to, can we say, buy into it, then we will be saved. We will survive. Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's saying, it's going to be really difficult for rich people to be saved. And the disciples are thinking, well, hang on. If they can't be saved, then there's no chance for us to be saved. And Jesus is saying, no. He said, stop thinking like men because that's how men think. But God views things differently. And all we need to say is, if we're talking about survival and salvation, then God has it all set out in the Bible. And like John Thomas said, you need to grab your Bible in one hand, and if you need to, his book in the other hand, and figure out what it really does talk about and what it really does mean. This is kind of the idiot's guide to how natural selection works. We have a population of beetles, an imaginary one, hypothetical. They are beetles that can interbreed of the same species, only some of them turn out brown and some of them turn out green, just like some people turn out with dark hair and some turn out with blonde hair. The bird comes along, happens to like green ones, picks them off. Then there are less and less green beetles in a population, and they don't pass the genes on because they don't breed because the birds ate them. And you'll notice in picture number 3, the baby beetles are turning out to be predominantly brown. Until in the end, all the beetles are brown, there aren't any green beetles left. That's kind of how the process works. And that's how it works out generationally. Now, it's got not a lot to do with selective breeding. Kind of my area of, not expertise, but selective breeding says you can take an ordinary brown goldfish and you can turn it by means of genetic selection into these other more fancy and more desirable type of goldfish. You can have selective breeding, that's what I do. And I try to make a bunch of black ones and a bunch of orange ones. But it is not natural selection, because if a mutation like the little guy on the top over here on the right was out in the wild, then he'd be the first to get picked off. There's no way he would ever breed. And this is just what people do. I mean, you don't think that there were 200 species of sheep originally when God created them. No, there weren't. It's just man's interference, and that's called selective breeding. Well, problem number 5 is these homologous structures. Darwin said, well, what would you want to use the same skeletal plan for very different types of appendages? He said, they came from the same ancestors. Look, they've got the same bones. Only some have turned out to be birds, and some have turned out to be whales, and some have turned out to be bats. Well, I don't think that really should be much of a problem for us, because if the same creator created all of those things that we read about in Genesis 1 with similar bones, slightly differently, slightly different adaptations perhaps, and slightly different uses, but why would that be a problem to anybody? You get cars designed in different parts of the world. They've all got 4 wheels. They've all got a number of doors. They've all got windows, usually. God created all of these animals, and he made them to function in their various ways. This is not Darwin's term, irreducible complexity. But he did talk about the idea, really, because he noticed that even when things seem to be kind of simple, and the mousetrap is a really simple device designed to kill mice, even a simple device like this needs all of its components to do the job. You take away one of those components and you are less likely to kill a mouse, which is all it's designed for. You know, you take away the thing that holds the bar back and you've got nothing to hold the bar back and the mouse just eats the cheese. You take away any one of those parts and all you're left with is a pile of bits that doesn't do what it was designed for. Can you see where this is going? If you can see that up there, then you are looking through your eye and you're looking through a very complicated anatomy. You can't take bits of that away or build it up just from bits and have it work. Irreducible complexity. Now, Darwin wouldn't have argued with that, I don't think, if he'd had it put before him. He admitted himself that the complexity of the human eye gave him pause about his theory. He could see that for the eye to develop as ours are now, a lot of things had to be lined up. And scientists have said Darwin's explanation was totally inadequate to explain how our eyes are put together and how they work. Now, you'd think in 150 years scientists would have cracked that, wouldn't you? But no, they haven't. They are no closer now to figuring out how the first little cell of an eye was in advance to the wee blobby animal that came up in the imaginary pond, and how that developed into more than one cell, and how that became twice as effective as the first little blobby bit of eye on that animal. There isn't any fossil evidence at all in the world that would show a gradual step-by-step evolution from the simple eye to the complex eye that we're blessed to have now. It takes an intelligent designer to design something as good as that. And Darwin said in his book, The Origin of the Species, this organ exists that seems very unlikely to have been produced by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Can I read that to you again? He said, if a complex organ exists, and let's stay with the eye, that seems very unlikely to have been produced by numerous successive, very slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And I think we would probably say, well, Darwin, I'm sorry, but it has. I don't know why they call these things black boxes. Maybe some of them are black. I assume every aeroplane that flies, there's a flight recorder so that if anything goes wrong, somebody who knows about such things can get the information out of them. The problem Darwin had when he put together his theory was there was a black box of information that he didn't have access to. and this is not my idea, the black box, it's what people have said about Darwin. There was a whole raft of information that he didn't have access to. And if he had known, he might have changed what he told us. Now, this is one of the billions and billions and billions of cells and the bodies of animals and the parts of plants and so on. This is a generalised look at inside a cell. Now, Darwin couldn't see that. He couldn't see that the outside of that cell, encasing it is a membrane which allows food in and waste to go out. He couldn't see the tiny mitochondria, the little blue things inside the cell. They're the power plants for the cell. They're the things that produce the fuel for the cell. And we can produce our own body weight in fuel to keep our cells going every day of our lives if we're a fit and active person. He didn't know that inside each cell, each little tiny, less than pinprick of a piece of a person, there is an internal clock that controls the cells, the way it produces these things. He didn't know that inside, in the middle of the cell, is a nucleus, and in that nucleus, 3 pairs of chromosomes, all wrapped up with DNA, which define us, which say, I have white hair because my mother had white hair, and I have whatever colour eyes I have. I haven't looked for a long time. Everything in every one of my cells has that little code in it that says this is the colour that your eyes are going to be, this is how your voice will sound, this is what your personality's going to be. All of those things that we can't really help. Now, could any of these things, even down at this really tiny level, have been the result of a lightning strike in a mineral-rich primordial soup, as they've described? No, of course not. I mean, it's all right to have a look at a human cell, but what about the little tiny things, the things that they would say spontaneously generated? Well, a bacterium, the tiniest, is also far more complicated than just a little blob in a puddle. That little tail on the thing is actually the motor by which a bacteria gets around because it's living in liquid. That little motor is controlled by 40 or so proteins within that bacterial cell itself. If it goes half the right speed, it doesn't move. If it goes twice the speed, it can't keep up the food supply. It has to go to exactly the right speed so it can go through the liquid. It has to be so precise that people have said, you know, it's kind of like a machine that a human would have designed. It didn't get there by accident. Well, another one of the things in the black box that I'm known about is DNA. Two wonderful things happened at the end of 1953. I was born, and a couple of doctors called Watson and Crick, their discovery of DNA in the cells. The picture we've got up on the screen it doesn't quite do it justice, really. But our genetic information is all held on something that looks fairly similar to that, apparently, like rungs on a spiral ladder made up of a number of chemicals on a sugar phosphate base, apparently. Now, the DNA from you, from one of your cells, would stretch nearly 2 metres. So if you could pull it out, it would stretch nearly 2 metres. That's from one cell. One strand of DNA is 50 millionths of a millimetre wide. So it's not big. And if you strung all of your DNA together, and I don't know who took the time to work this out, if you strung all of the DNA and all of your cells together, it would make a string somewhere between 15 and 50 billion kilometres long. And a strand of your DNA stretched between you and the sun would weigh about a 50th of an ounce. So Darwin couldn't know any of this stuff. He saw that individuals were individuals, but he couldn't know what was driving that. He couldn't really have known that our own bodies contain more atoms than stars there are in the universe, that we would have 90,000 k's of blood vessels. He couldn't know that, or he might have been able to calculate that we would blink about 400 million times before we blinked for the last time. He couldn't have known that, or he possibly did, that our eyes can distinguish millions of different shades and process that information back to our brain quicker than computers can. He couldn't, well, perhaps he did know this too, that the billions of cells in your body all came from that one single sperm and one single egg cell from your parents. And probably he didn't know that one cell that started off with would divide and become one of 200 different types, all with the same genetic information in it. Now, did that happen by accident? We don't think so. Now, when we think about the fossil record and what Darwin was kind of up against, he said the varieties which have formerly existed on the earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graded organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Do you remember I said that he reluctantly wrote on the origin of the species? There was friends of his that said, hey, you've got to get this stuff written down, you've got to put it out there, despite the fact that he had these misgivings. Well, back in 1967, we'll go back to that, Mr. Cooper showed us this picture, very similar, of horses. How they went from a very small four-toed creature known as Eohippus up to the modern horse, which is known as Equus, I think. Now that seems fairly reasonable, don't you think? Only it wasn't how it happened. The number of fossils found in any one part of the world is only one. So they found Eohippus somewhere, but they found these other horses spread out. There is no evidence to show that they were in any way related to each other. They had different numbers of ribs and so on. And paleontologists no longer believe that that's a relevant way of showing the development of the horse. And it was pretty effective, but it wasn't the way it happened. What about the Cambrian explosion? You might have heard about it. Have a bit of a problem with the Cambrian explosion. This just shows a whole lot of animals together at the same time. They said it needed to be 500 million years ago because a whole bunch of animals showed up in a strata all at once. What a surprise. Why do we think that might have been? Well, it could have been related to somewhere around Genesis chapter 1. It's a troubling thing for people who still are attracted to Darwin's theories. The sudden appearance of so many vastly different and vastly well-developed animals. Or how another thing that we've seen. If you have a look on the right-hand column, you'll see that that's pretty much how a human embryo develops. And Darwin said, look how similar they are. They all came from the same thing. And he said, do you see in the top row how they've all got gills? They all came out of the sea. Seemed pretty obvious, really. Well, medical science would tell us that a lot of our organs and things develop on the outside, or start on the outside and then go from the inside, because there wasn't much inside to those very tiny animals. They used to call them gill slits, they no longer do. The first pouches are apparently, or the first little indentation, are your tonsils. And Darwinists said, well, we don't need them for a start, and when I was a kid they took mine out, and they may have taken yours out too. At the first sign of a cold, you're in hospital, they took your tonsils out. You didn't need them, because on the evolutionary cycle, that was something that some animal needed earlier on. They don't do it quite so much anymore. In fact, you don't hear about it very much at all. Other glands and things were those other little indentations on there. It was a pretty picture, and it was quite effective. And it looked like it could have been true, but it wasn't. Scientists talk too much now about vestigial structures or vestigial organs. You know, we've got a tailbone. Apparently it's quite useful in being a place for the muscles and so on, and vital parts of your backbone structure. to all be located there. Nothing to do with the tail. Probably shouldn't even be called a tailbone. Coccyx, they're called. Or the little tiny bones down the back end of a whale, which proved to some scientists that one time the whale walked on land and then got sick of that and went into the water. I don't know how seriously we can take that or need to take it. Then there's the fossil record. We've seen these pictures all over the place. There in 2A is a primitive creature from prehistoric times, and in 2B is a modern bird. And they're so similar that they must have developed one from the other. This is a quote from an article in a Newsweek magazine. The missing link between man and apes, whose absence has comforted religious fundamentalists since the days of Darwin, is merely the most glamorous in a whole hierarchy of phantom creatures. The more scientists have searched for transitional forms that lie between species, the more they've been frustrated. There are no links. You can't turn from 2A into 2B, from a prehistoric animal into a modern bird. And there's no evidence to show that they ever did. I do remember this very vividly. What happened in England during the Industrial Revolution is that the place was filled with smoke, the bark was black, and there was a species of moth, some of whom were white and some of whom were black. And as you can imagine, the white moths didn't do so well. The birds could see them and got them. Now, that was a bulletproof proof that evolution was happening. Did you know that it was just an experiment? That the photographs that we were shown, that I was shown as a kid, were of dead moths glued onto the bark of trees, that the moths never actually lived there in the first place. They lived up in the branches of trees. They don't tell you that when they stopped the Industrial Revolution in England, the barks of the trees went back to a more barky colour, and the white moths are quite happily living there still. So it wasn't exactly how Darwin imagined it, and they were a bit remiss telling us that this was a full-blown fact. And they have discredited the experiments that made that whole moth thing true for us in 1967. Now, one of these two men who went in the opposite directions was right. But I think we'd have to agree only one of them was. What we really need to do is say, well, which one? Who was it? What the gentleman on the right, John Thomas, discovered was that there was a future for him. And he, in that book entitled Elpis Israel, an exposition on the kingdom of God. And that his future, and the future of any of us who are interested, was wrapped up with the hope of Israel and a future for the whole of the earth. And for those who turn their energies and attention to the God who created it all. Now, we have got a little pamphlet which talks about Elpis Israel, and it's got chapter 1 written there. Grab one, take it and read it. In fact, you don't even have to pay for the book because you can get it off the internet if you like. Dr. Thomas talked about the future. He said that God purposed in himself before the world began to set up a kingdom, the attributes of which should be glory, honour, incorruptibility, and life to all who should possess it. Now that's a good looking future. He said that God promised David's throne throughout all generations, and that he should never want for a man to sit upon his throne. That all who would inherit this kingdom, Abraham, hence linking to Israel, of course, and joined ears with the Messiah, and that they who hope of God may become the subjects of repentance and remission of sins. This is what we have to do. And by being baptised into the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These are direct quotes from the author of that book. So do we have a lot of time? Well, verse 44 talks about a time in the political arena, and he's talking about this image that the king of Babylon saw. He said, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." Now that's the hope of the Bible, and that's the hope of the very near future. Darwin was absolutely wrong when he made the conclusions that he did, and we think John Thomas, who went in the other direction, was absolutely right. And you'll have to decide for yourself.